Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tenzin Pende. I'm official city photographer as well as staff of Tibet Museum. So today, as we have twice a month talk, this time Mr. John Gaudette from Denver, Colorado, will be speaking on international law and Tibet, crime against humanity, self-determination, and accountability. So first of all, I would like to tell a bit about our speaker. Mr. John is from Denver, Colorado. He did his master in international human rights and bachelor in government, and he got his Juris Doctor international law certificate in May 2012. As of his experience, right now he is doing legal research interns in Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy. He researched and drafted report about the application of international criminal justice in Tibet, drafted articles for publication on website concerning human rights, torture, and corporate social responsibility. He even does interns in several organizations such as International Criminal Law Practicum Denver, Shushet, Herzog, and Brandon, then Aslam Law Practicum, Conflict Defender Office, Canton, New York. Even he did as a research assistant at Direct Research for David Eckerson, Denver, and even did field manager at Grassroots Campaign Incorporation, Denver. He taught English throughout northern Thailand as a part of summer program in 2002. So it's just a bit about our speaker, John Gaudette. So I would like to give him the mic and tell about the topic, international law and Tibet. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. So thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you everyone for showing up. And yeah, if you can't hear me or anything like that, just wave and I'll try to speak louder and move the microphone closer. And a special thanks to the Tibet Museum for putting on this event. As Tenzin mentioned, I'm John Gaudette. I'm a legal research intern at the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy. And I'll be talking today about how recent developments in international criminal law affect human rights advocacy in Tibet. Specifically, I'm going to focus on three topics: the commission of crimes against humanity in Tibet, external self-determination for the Tibetan people, and different methods of accountability for the commission of crimes against humanity. But before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about the history of what's happened in Tibet. There are a lot of great resources and information in the museum, so for the most part I'll be focusing on the law, but just so that we're all on the same page, I think just a very quick run-through of the history of the Tibetan situation. And so I'll start by talking about 1950 was when the Chinese invaded Tibet. Before that, it was essentially its own independent state. And there's a lot of good information just over behind some of the posters about the evidence demonstrating that Tibet was an independent country before 1950. But in 1950, the People's Liberation Army rolled into Tibet and essentially overwhelmed the Tibetan people and established control. And then in 1959, the Dalai Lama fled to Dharamsala, here where we are now. And fast forwarding very quickly to the 2008 protests, because for the talk I'll be focusing on the events that have happened in Tibet since 2008, so since the protests and forward. In 2008 there were spontaneous protests throughout Tibet, and those protests resulted in the commission of crimes against humanity. And the Chinese had what they described as a merciless crackdown on the Tibetan people who were protesting. And this included the use of torture, arbitrary detention, and murder. Now, since then, there have been 122 self-immolations, and the Tibetans have gotten no rights. So the first part of this talk, I'll be talking about crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity, and in this I'll have 3 points. First, I'll talk briefly about the importance of crimes against humanity and why they're worth talking about. And then I'll go into the 2 separate elements required for proving crimes against humanity under international law. First of all, though, it's important to know why we're talking about crimes against humanity. Talking about crimes against humanity is one of the 3 crimes that have been pursued by the International Criminal Courts since 1993. The other 2 are war crimes and genocide. Of those 3 crimes, war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity is the most frequently prosecuted at international courts. And in the International Criminal Court's investigations, in Kenya, Libya, and Mali, it is the only crime being prosecuted. This is for 2 reasons. One, because crimes against humanity can be very general, whereas a discussion of war crimes is very specific because you have to demonstrate that there is an internal or external armed conflict going on. And second, because genocide requires the proving of the specific intent to destroy a group of people. So assimilation or cultural genocide does not meet the legal threshold for genocide. They have to have the intent to commit genocide. And that has made even what we consider of genocide, such as the genocide in Cambodia, where a quarter of the population was killed by the Khmer Rouge, or even Darfur, very difficult cases to pursue. Crimes against humanity is not as specific, and it's not as difficult to prove as genocide, and it's not as specific as war crimes, but it is at the same level of accountability as those 2 crimes. The other reason to talk about crimes against humanity is because it accurately describes what is happening in Tibet, and it is also more powerful. Usually when we hear about Tibet, we hear about widespread human rights abuses or numerous human rights abuses. That does not accurately describe what is happening in Tibet. When you talk about human rights abuses, you're referring to a single specific act, and that act is alone and isolated. So if the police beat somebody up on the street, that is a human rights abuse. When the police beat somebody up on the street as part of an organized policy to attack people, that is a crime against humanity. And it is much more powerful, and it describes what is happening in Tibet today. Additionally, talking about crimes against humanity elevates the discussion to a higher level of international offenses. There are numerous instances of human rights abuse. However, crimes against humanity and some human rights can be ignored in certain circumstances. And the classic example is that you cannot shout fire in a crowded movie theater. You have freedom of speech, but not that far. However, there is absolutely no instance where you can legally commit crimes against humanity. And because of that, talking about crimes against humanity raises it to another level. It raises it to a level where if you commit crimes against humanity, there are certain severe consequences that follow, such as obligations to arrest, prosecute, or extradite the offenders. And as we are seeing recently with Omar al-Bashir, with Sudan, who is indicted by the International Criminal Court for, among other things, crimes against humanity, it makes travel very difficult. So with that context in place, I'll move on to the 2 specific elements required for crimes against humanity. The first group is called the chapeau elements, which is French for hat. And that provides the context for crimes against humanity. It makes them what they are. Because crimes against humanity consists of the chapeau elements, and it consists of the underlying criminal offenses. The underlying criminal offenses, which I'll talk about next, are already violations of international law. However, what makes them crimes against humanity is when they're committed in the context of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population with knowledge of the attack. This means that it isn't just the isolated human rights abuse that we talked about earlier. Instead, it is actually a campaign affecting numerous people. And crimes against humanity are defined in the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court, and that is the most definitive and recent definition of crimes against humanity, and that's the definition that we'll be using today. Under the Rome Statute, in Article 7, it lays out the chapeau elements, and there are 4 specific elements that must be fulfilled. First, there must be a widespread or systematic, and second, attack. Third, against a civilian population, and fourth, there must be knowledge of the attack. A widespread or systematic attack is an attack that affects either a large geographical area or a large number of people, if it's widespread, and it's systematic if it is part of an organized plan or policy. With Tibet, both of these are fulfilled. Tibet encompasses about 25% of China's landmass, and there are about 6 million Tibetans when we include not only the Tibet Autonomous Region, but Tibetans living in Qinghai, Gansu, Yunnan, and Sichuan provinces. So with 6 million people and a quarter of China's territory, that fulfills the widespread requirement. For the systematic requirement, we see here a meeting where Chinese officials are coming together to talk about Tibetan policy. In this one, they're talking about how to control Tibetan Buddhism. But there have also been meetings, such as the 5th Tibet Forum, which happened in 2010, where over 200 Chinese leaders got together and formulated a policy for how to govern Tibet. Not just the Tibet Autonomous Region, but anywhere where Tibetans live. In the 5th Tibet Forum, unfortunately the Chinese haven't told us specifically what they decided. However, we can make inferences. Recently, the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy, or TCHRD, received a manual from the People's Armed Police in Sichuan province, helping the police handle post-traumatic stress after crushing the 2008 uprising. In there, they said that the People's Armed Police may suffer traumatic flashbacks of images of firing on monks, and they may be hesitant to act and fulfill their duty, but encouraged them by saying that not only was the People's Armed Police behind them, but so was the entire Chinese government, and it specifically mentioned Hu Jintao by name. From forums like this on Buddhism, we can infer that there is a Chinese policy that involves, as they described it in the PAP manual, a merciless repression of the Tibetan people. Therefore, we have both a widespread and systematic attack therefore, what's happening in Tibet is widespread and systematic. An attack is something that must be done it involves multiple commissions of underlying offenses. And I'll be talking about 3 specific underlying offenses in just a moment. And you can see evidence of those crimes all through the museum, because it's actually quite a wonderful exhibit. And if you haven't looked yet, do. With that plug out of the way, the civilian population. There's been some debate about what constitutes a civilian population. And here we have to go into humanitarian law, or the law of armed conflict. Because a civilian population is one that is not combatants. And there may be some gray areas, and there's some debate among the international legal community about what that exactly entails. But everyone agrees that unarmed monks, bystanders, nomads, the people who are being persecuted in Tibet, are not combatants under any standard. And therefore it is an attack against the civilian population. The knowledge element of the last element of the chapeau elements, the knowledge element, can again be inferred by the organization of what we see in Tibet. That includes the use in the meetings where it was over 200 members at the 5th Tibet Work Forum, the publication of the PAP manual, and meetings like this. So with that out of the way, we can move to the underlying criminal offenses. The first we'll talk about 3 underlying criminal offenses, though there are 11 listed in the Rome Statute. And a lot of them have been committed, but for now we'll focus on 3. We'll talk about murder, arbitrary detention, and torture. So moving directly to torture. Torture. Torture is defined in the Torture Convention, or the Convention Against Torture. And it is defined as the intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering. And the Rome Statute adds an additional requirement that the person must be under the control of whoever is committing the torture. So here we have to prove intent, and we have to prove severe pain or suffering, and that it's not, yeah. So with torture, it's actually fairly clear-cut, because there's some debate, thanks to the Bush administration, about what exactly is severe pain or suffering. And the Israeli Supreme Court actually had an opinion that became very definitive in the international legal community, saying that it cannot be incidental to holding a prisoner. So if you arrest somebody, you handcuff them. But you don't handcuff them to a chair that forces their legs to swell. You don't keep them there for a week. You don't electrocute people. And all of that is what's happening in China. Specifically, there are two methods of torture that the Chinese are using. The first is positional torture, and the second is the use of electrocution. Positional torture was adopted from both North Korea during the Korean War and the Soviet Union, as they gave tips, essentially, to the Chinese government and Mao Zedong about how to solidify their control over the territory. Positional torture involves putting people in uncomfortable positions and forcing them to stay like that for hours, days, or weeks. In China, the two most famous methods are the tiger bench and the death chair. The death chair you can actually see online advertised by a supplier to the Chinese. And it involves having manacles on the chair so you cannot move your legs or arms. And people are kept there for a week. That causes muscles to atrophy, bones to swell, and in extreme cases, kidneys to fail. Electrocution is a favorite method of torture for people who are not actually concerned about getting information. Because what happens when you electrocute somebody is that their muscles clench up, including their jaw, so they can't talk. But it's a very effective method of torture if you don't want people to know that you're torturing. Because the only effect of electrocuting somebody is small burn marks, which quickly heal. So it's a method of what's referred to as clean torture, or torture where you can torture somebody and then put them before a judge, put them before the media, and there's no evidence of what happened, but it still has the effect of breaking their psyche. And yeah, there's actually just over there is a display of some of the torture devices used, including electric batons. And a lot of those have been smuggled out of Tibet. And particularly after 2008, during the protest, people were taken to detention centers where they were held for days and tortured repeatedly on a routine. And that involved suspending them from the ceilings by their thumbs and other positional tortures and electrocutions. Moving on to arbitrary detention. Arbitrary detention under international law is one where you're not given due process. You're not given a hearing before an impartial magistrate or judge. In the case of China, they actually have what's effectively legalized arbitrary detention in the form of re-education through labor. Re-education through labor was adopted from the Soviet Gulag system, and it essentially allows the police to unilaterally send somebody to a re-education through labor camp for ostensibly minor offenses. It's designed to be for people who don't merit a real criminal punishment, and that's the justification for bypassing the judicial system. However, people are kept there for 3 to 4 years, and in some instances, such as in Meiyang in Sichuan province, they're forced to labor 20 hours a day on a starvation diet. And the consequences of that are fairly predictable. So, the Special Rapporteur from the United Nations on extrajudicial killings and the Special Rapporteur on arbitrary detention have both spoken out against the use of re-education through labor, describing it as inherently arbitrary. And this is a system that the Chinese government in 2008, during its periodic review at the United Nations, said they would abolish, and it still exists today. Though there are some indications that the Chinese are winding it down, there are also indications that they're replacing it with another system. However, that doesn't change the fact that it is inherently arbitrary detention, a violation of international law, and because of the fulfillment of the Shepo elements, it is a crime against humanity. The last element, the last crime we'll talk about is murder. And murder is fairly straightforward. You just have to kill one or more people and knowingly and intentionally do that conduct. Especially during the 2008 protests, the police would fire indiscriminately into protests. And by some estimates, over 200 people were killed in this manner. firing indiscriminately into crowds fulfills the knowledge requirement because you know the foreseeable consequence of shooting into a crowd of people is that someone is going to be shot and someone is going to be killed. And we've seen continued instances of the police firing into crowds and in some cases killing people. For example, recently in Tawu, Tawu on July 6th, Tibetans got together to celebrate His Holiness's birthday. After some disagreement, the police fired into the crowd, and people were shot in the head, people were shot 7 times, and fortunately so far there are no instances of death, but there are other similar instances, and there are also people who die in prison, and there are people who are tortured to death. And the common tactic in China is that when they're torturing somebody, and it's clear they're not doing well, they are released, and then they're left to die a few days later in a hospital so that they're not dying in the prison. And that's a quick overview of the crimes against humanity in the Commission. So for all of these, in more details you can see the library or ask because there'll be time for questions. But for all of these, because they're committed in the context of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population, they are crimes against humanity. Now the remainder of this talk will focus on what can be done about the commission of crimes against humanity. First, we'll talk about the International Criminal Court, because even though it is a court of last resort, it's designed to be it's essentially what everyone's heard of, and it's where the definition of crimes against humanity comes from. Unfortunately, the International Criminal Court is a court of limited jurisdiction, which means that it can only hear cases if certain criteria are met. With regards to Tibet, most criteria are met. However, the one that's not is state consent. For the International Court to function, because the International Court, like the entire international legal system, is organized horizontally as opposed to vertically, it relies on the consent of states. That means that for the court to have jurisdiction, someone must agree to the court having jurisdiction. To date, 120 states have consented to the court's jurisdiction. However, China, Russia, the United States, and a few other major powers have not. And in particular, Southeast Asia does not have many states that have consented to the court's jurisdiction. Now, especially with regard to China, though, this is a problem, because the International Criminal Court can have jurisdiction over situations that are referred to it by the United Nations Security Council. And that's what happened in the case of Sudan, Libya, and that's what people are calling for today in Syria, is to have the Security Council refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, and therefore they have jurisdiction. However, the Security Council is governed effectively by the 5 states that have a veto, which means if they oppose a resolution, it cannot go forward. And those 5 states are the victors from World War II: England, France, Russia, the United States, and China. So if China does not want the International Criminal Court to investigate the situation in Tibet, it can stop it. However, there are ways of working around China, though unfortunately none are likely to succeed. And that brings us to self-determination. Because in 2009, the Palestinians attempted to agree to the court's jurisdiction by saying that they are a state, and the Rome Statute is open to any state. Therefore, the Palestinians said, because we're a state, we can sign the Rome Statute and give the court jurisdiction. However, the International Criminal Court is only 10 years old, and they did not really want to handle the Israel-Palestine conflict. So what they did was they said, in cases of doubt, you have to go to the General Assembly, and they'll recognize you as a state. And for Palestine they did, and for political reasons, Palestine is not acceded to the Rome Statute yet. And Tibet could attempt to do a similar approach, either by declaring that historically, before 1950, Tibet is an independent state, or by exercising their right to self-determination. To be a state, you must fulfill 4 criteria. You must have a territory, population, a government, and the ability to enter into foreign relations with other states. And this is a historical argument that a lot of people have made very effectively. And we have exhibits here, like I mentioned earlier, that include photos of Tibetan passports and recognition granted to Tibet before the Chinese invasion. What I'm going to focus on, though, is the Tibetans' right to self-determination, which is independent of whether they have any right to whether they exist as a state. For self-determination, there are two forms of self-determination. There's internal self-determination and external self-determination. Internal self-determination involves exercising the people having their will followed by a government. And in Tibet, this does not exist. And there's a TCHRD is coming out with a report in the next year or so, I think. They'll address grassroots democracy in Tibet and how China enunciates standards but doesn't follow them. And effectively, the Tibetans have no voice in how Tibet is governed. For now, though, because we're talking about the context of international criminal law, I'm going to focus on external self-determination, or essentially the right to secession. The idea of external self-determination was articulated by Vladimir Lenin, one of the founders, or the philosophical father, essentially, of China and communism in China. In 1916, he said everyone should have the right to self-determination. And as a nice little twist, Woodrow Wilson, the then President of the United States, also said everyone should have the right to self-determination. However, Woodrow Wilson didn't really know what he was getting into, because all the colonies, and at that time there was about a third of the world's population in 100 colonies, said, let us be free. And people panicked. So they've been very careful about limiting the right to self-determination. After World War II, this involved, self-determination was the method of decolonization. The United Nations created non-self-governing treaties and said that the goal was to lead them to independence or joining the state as they choose. And there were almost 100 at the time the United Nations was founded. Now there are maybe half a dozen, including Puerto Rico and a few other places that don't quite have their status determined. But what happened is that as external self-determination was effective at decolonizing, specifically in the 1960s, people looked for other uses of it and other applications. And so the next application was as a form of fighting apartheid. So South Africa, Rhodesia, Southern Africa, and those states said that because they're under alien occupation from a racist regime, they have a right to self-determination. And in the 1990s, the South African government they were able to exercise their right to self-determination. We had the election of Nelson Mandela. Since the end of the Cold War, and particularly during the breakup of Yugoslavia, states said, we have a right to self-determination because we've been oppressed. And they draw on the United Nations Charter, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, all of which recognize the right of self-determination for peoples. And a peoples is someone who is a unique ethnic, cultural, minority group that's subject to alien occupation. And by all accounts, the Tibetans fit that. However, whether they actually can exercise this right of self-determination is not so clear. Because Kosovo, for example, said that they are an independent state because they are subject to genocide. In Canada, Quebec voted for secession. And in a landmark case, the Supreme Court there said, there is a right to self-determination if you're denied participation in your government in cases of extreme human rights abuses. And this is called the remedial right of self-determination. However, they said, Quebec, you've been treated great. You've had presidents of Canada, so you don't get the right. And there has been some effort recently, for example, in Scotland, to grant the right of external self-determination to people who would not necessarily be entitled to it under the remedial right of self-determination. But the Tibetans are. as the Commission of Crimes Against Humanity, the Commission of Cultural Genocide. All of this stuff means that the Tibetans have suffered, and as a peoples, they are entitled to the right of external self-determination, particularly because they've been denied the right to internal self-determination. And that brings, however, the problem with that is that if Tibet were to say, we're an independent state, and they can do that under international law, there is nothing that prohibits a state from declaring independence. And that is the International Court of Justice, the chief judicial body of the United Nations, said that in 2011. So Tibet can say, we are independent. But that has to be recognized by people who matter. And in the case of acceding to the Rome Statute and joining the International Criminal Court, that means the General Assembly. Right now, there are about 193 states in the United Nations. 54 of them are from Africa, and China is investing in 50 of those African states. China has the power and influence to effectively prevent Tibetans from gaining recognition at the General Assembly, and therefore preventing Tibet from acceding to the Rome Statute. However, that brings me to the final point, which is that there are other methods of accountability. This is an example of, I think it was the International Tibet Campaign, holding a protest against Intercontinental, a large hotel conglomerate who's opening a hotel in Lhasa. And it's fairly straightforward. They're saying that Intercontinental is in bed with the Chinese, and that they're overlooking the Commission of Human Rights Abuses. And what's happened though, and this is an example of how effective, how there are different methods outside of the International Criminal Court to make people accountable. And most dramatic changes have been made, not by courts, but by people, in organizations, and people getting together and fighting oppression. I'll focus on 3 different methods. First, I'll talk about the United Nations, the supranational options other than the International Criminal Court. Then I'll talk about what states can do. And finally, I'll talk about what individuals and organizations can do. So first, the United Nations. The main body of the United Nations that talks about human rights is the Human Rights Council. And this is their office with a wonderful ceiling. And the Human Rights Council in less than a month now, China will be undergoing their Universal Periodic Review. Every state, all 193, every 4 years, goes through a Universal Periodic Review where their human rights record is examined, and they're issued recommendations for how to improve it, and some praise, because everyone likes to praise someone. And since it's every state, eventually it comes around. And so, for example, China takes this very seriously. Even though China has taken the stand that it's meddling in their internal affairs and other arguments like that, they take it very seriously, and they want to look good in the world. However, when you have a legitimate organization like the United Nations saying that China must abolish re-education through labor, it must grant people equal rights, it must stop discriminating, it must stop torturing, that matters. And when you bring cases specifically to the attention of the United Nations, that gets international attention on China that they do not want. And this is a method of trying to get China to change their human rights policy regarding Tibet. The United Nations, as I'm sure we all know, especially with what's happening in Syria, has its drawbacks, but it's also the most effective organization there is on a supranational level. For states, the most common thing, or the easiest thing for states to do, is to implement universal jurisdiction. And that means that they're trying to bring the Chinese to court and hold them accountable for the commission of crimes. And this is where describing what's happened in Tibet as crimes against humanity is so important. Because there's not universal jurisdiction for human rights abuses. There is universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity. And in some cases, there's universal jurisdiction for torture. As was the case with Pinochet when he went to England and was almost sent to Spain to face trial there. But universal jurisdiction, and here is an example of Spain exercising universal jurisdiction to bring Hu Jintao, I think it was a civil case, to try and hold him accountable for what he did as he was president or as he was the head of the Chinese state, and even before, in 1988, when he authorized a crackdown on Tibetans protesting. This was actually ineffective because the instant the Chinese saw one of their former heads of states was being prosecuted by a court, they threw everything they could to stop it. And Spain changed their universal jurisdiction law to say that there must be some connection to the state for them to exercise that. However, the important thing about international criminal law is it's not focused on the leaders. It's focused on the people most responsible, and that is the people who can change policy. So instead of focusing on Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping and the leaders of the Chinese state, you can focus on local people who are implementing Chinese policy. And not only will the Chinese government be less willing to throw everything on the line to defend them, but they have more at stake. The party secretaries who are in charge of the Tibetan autonomous regions and provinces are using it as a stepping stone to build their career. And by focusing on them, by not only using universal jurisdiction, but denying people the access to airspace, refusing to talk to them and deal with them, refusing to invest, that can change Chinese policy at a level where people need to look good. The Chinese party secretaries need to look good so that they can advance their careers. And if committing crimes against humanity prevents them from doing that, they'll think twice. Not only will they think twice about ordering crimes against humanity, but they'll think twice about disciplining people who are too lenient on Tibetans. And they'll also think twice about holding people accountable for what they do, so that they can say, it's not me, it's the local police are going out of line. And there are some Chinese provinces outside of Tibet where, in the wake of an outcry on the internet, they've disciplined the people responsible, including an instance of the police beating to death a street vendor, and one police officer picked up a 7-month-old baby and threw her to the ground. And in that instance, both were filmed, got online, they got a huge outcry from the Chinese public, and the direct people involved were disciplined, and I think, it's pending exactly what will happen, but they're currently suspended. So states have an awful lot of tools that they can use. And when you look at the diverse actors who are committing crimes against humanity, each one is susceptible to the tools that states can use. And then finally, the last point is that we have individual actors, we have collective action, and we have organizations like TCHRD and the other NGOs in this town and globally. And what they can do is they can organize action. So you have boycotts, and that was very effective in removing apartheid South Africa, because corporations refused to work with South Africa. The Sullivan Principles, for example, stated that we're not going to follow apartheid, and this will hopefully bring about a change in the South African regime. And when it didn't, they left. And that was one of many factors that contributed to the downfall of apartheid. Individuals can boycott. Individuals can also pressure their governments and other actors, including the United Nations, to take action. So for example, in the United States, you can not only pressure you can not only write to Obama, but you can write to governors, you can write to congressmen, you can write to senators. When you start looking at the number of people who can act, all of them can make an impact. And China needs to invest in the international community. China needs to be part of the international community. China cannot live like Burma did, or North Korea. And because they're dependent on the international community, everyone can make an impact. If that's boycotting China, which is very difficult to do, but if that's standing up and saying Intercontinental should not have a hotel in Tibet, or if that's standing up and saying Apple should not invest in China if they cannot have fair hiring practices that includes Uyghurs and Tibetans, that makes an impact. And corporations, people, and everyone can get together and have pressure. So that's a fairly quick run-through of just what the international legal system can do and what it means for Tibet. And now I'll open it up to questions. And hopefully there are some, because otherwise I'll just keep talking. Could everyone hear the question? Okay. He asked which states are doing the most to change the situation in Tibet. And it's a tricky question because a lot of states are doing different things. So for example, the United States has given the Dalai Lama a Congressional Medal of Freedom and says we support the Dalai Lama. The European Union sent somebody to Tibet just from September 9th to September 18th to look at the human rights situation. Lithuania has said, and so in that regard, there aren't many, and it depends just how strong you want to say real action is. Yes?
So the International Court can't act because China doesn't want them to, right? Because they are part of it.
Right.
But I'm just wondering, isn't that like a bit weird not to have a law how can they say we don't want you to investigate against our
Yeah.
Of course not.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like if you ask for
Yeah.
something, they could do that too.
And that goes into essentially the basic structure of the international system. Because since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1640, the international system has been based on sovereign states being the fundamental building block. And everything from that has been built as equal. It requires the consent of states. And you can't, there's no international government or something that can impose its will on states. But what happens is China can say we don't want to have the International Criminal Court investigate us. But China cannot say there are no crimes against humanity. Because crimes against humanity are part of customary international law. And that's a binding principle of law, binding on all states, formed through widespread and consistent state practice, coupled with the sense that you're acting out of a legal obligation. And that means that even if China says, I don't believe in crimes against humanity, or I don't believe in civil and political rights, which is what they've come close to saying lately, legally, under international law, it doesn't matter. And that means that legally states and other bodies can take actions based on their violation of those rights. And yeah, it's not a perfect system, but it's the best we have, I guess.
Is there other attempts to change that system? Because I mean, that could happen somewhere else also, right? That US started to do something.
Yeah, there's some talk about having an enforcement mechanism, and there's talk of having a standing United Nations army, but the powerful states are the ones that are pushing against consenting to a lot of things, including the United States. And so it's unlikely right now that there will be any progress for there being a very hierarchical system. Yeah?
Can you tell us a little bit what is China's interest to control Tibet? Why did they go in and why do they want to control Tibet?
The question is, what's China doing in Tibet anyway? Why do they care about this very high elevation place? And Tibet controls most of the water through the Himalayas and the glaciers there. Most of the water for Asia originates in Tibet. And there's also a sense of Chinese manifest destiny, that at one point historically, Tibet was part of a Chinese dynasty. And so as China is rising, there's a very nationalistic trend to say China is larger China, includes all of what historically was China at its apex. And so that's also why they're interested in asserting their control over Taiwan, parts of Siberia, and those little spits of islands that they're fighting over with the Philippines, Indonesia, and Japan about. And it's also natural resources. And that's also the same reason that Belgium went into the Congo, and it was the same rationale behind colonialism. Yeah.
China in 2008 stated that they're not doing anything in Tibet that we didn't do in Australia when the British landed in 1788, etc. This consistency across history I'm just wondering about the assassination of Osama bin Laden. Sorry, I said that twice. Osama bin Laden. Was that a crime against humanity? Guantanamo Bay, all of those things. In terms of consistency, China is very quick to finger point at any areas where we're not consistent. How does this work?
Well, first, just as a preliminary point, so the question was whether China says the colonial powers, Australia, the United States included, did horrible things when they created their state. And some of them, like the United States, are still doing pretty horrible things. So who are you to judge us? And the first point is that the conduct of one person doesn't excuse the conduct of another. So even if the United States did the exact same things today that China is doing, that doesn't matter. It doesn't make it right. And also along those lines, that China there's no equivalency though between what China's doing and what the United States is doing now. But under the law, what the United States did in Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib was torture, and it was cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. And in that way, it violated international law. And I'll talk to you later if you want about the killing of Osama bin Laden, because that gets into an armed conflict. It would be an international armed conflict, but then it gets into preemptive self-defense, and I think that's more detailed than anyone wants to talk about today. If not, someone else can ask about it, but yeah.
What can a Tibetan that lives in exile do to help this whole process? Because a lot of them, I have a lot of Tibetan friends who they're kind of...
Petition to the United Nations, they can do all the things for collective action. If they're living in Switzerland, France, England, Germany, the United States, wherever, Australia, New Zealand, to the southern hemisphere, they can also petition the governments. But part of the Chinese narrative, which is again harkens back to colonialism, is that Tibetans are a barbaric people who need help civilizing. And the Chinese describe civilizing as becoming socialist. And the easiest thing Tibetans can do is just live. And when you meet a Tibetan, you know they're not a barbarian that needs to be socialized. And so there are very active things that can be done, and there are passive things. And it depends on just how much that person is willing to do, because people also have lives. And yeah. And a Tibetan might be able to answer that question a little better. And I won't put anyone on the spot. So, and then we'll talk about human rights. And if they move in opposite directions, it doesn't matter. And as you can imagine, trade has gone up, human rights have gone down, especially in Tibet after 2008. And so there is an inherent problem with that, but it's not necessary. And so for example, George W. Bush, despite all of his failings, he was very adamant about Tibet because he was very Christian. And so an attack on freedom of religion was very personal to him. And he made a point of mentioning it any time he met Hu Jintao. But if you say, but freedom of religion only resonates with certain people. If you talk about crimes against humanity, that puts the atrocities on the level of some of the worst people we can think of, and some of the worst conduct we can think of in the modern era, including the violence after elections in Kenya in 2007, 2008, and the Ivory Coast in 2011. So hopefully reframing it as crimes against humanity will be a way to kind of get people to be willing to sacrifice more.
I just wanted to actually respond. It's not a question, but I wanted to respond to that question. There was a report that was released recently by the International Campaign for Tibet and Tibet Network that actually highlights this relationship.
Because it's a diverse group.
So I wanted to respond to your question. So there's a report that was released on the eve of the G8 meeting, G8 summit, which basically highlights the nature of the relationship between China and other Western European powers, and how you often have these threats coming from China saying that, if you meet His Holiness, then we're going to cut down on this or that investment deal or trade or whatever it is. So when there was actually an analysis made of the connection between, for example, David Cameron meeting His Holiness and then the business deals between China or like the investment in China, those numbers actually don't change. So these are just hollow threads. So it's just to see and really emphasize on how it's a two-way relationship and how Western countries or the more powerful countries seem to be China as this huge economic power and what we're going to do if we talk about human rights. But this report just really highlights and stresses on the fact that it is two-way and China is as much dependent on the other countries as they are on China. So just coming at it from a different angle and saying that of course there are business deals, of course there is an economic trade relationship between China and other countries, but it's two-way. Yeah, just that when we're lobbying or when we're approaching heads of states, to keep that in mind also.
No, that's okay. My point was your point too, just because I was saying the way you're saying, if an action is larger by actually threatening China with stopping their trade, I think that's a bigger action than just giving someone a medal and recognizing the Dalai Lama. That's all I'm saying.
My question is what are the kind of big superpowers of Asia? How are they contributing? Places like Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, India. Because otherwise we get stuck in this kind of very dualistic. It's the West or it's China. But you think that why are we hearing more from Asia and Asian countries on Tibet? What's your view on that?
They speak for Asian countries, and I'm not too familiar with them. I know, especially during the border incursions earlier this summer, where China and India had a few disputes about the line of agreement or the line of control between China and India. There was some talk of playing the Tibet card, and India could recognize Tibet as independent and just create a whole lot of trouble very quickly. But I think China is, at least rhetorically, China is very, very defensive of their territorial integrity, which for them includes Tibet. And so they're going to, when you have other states talking about Tibet, they're putting a lot on the line because they don't know exactly how China will react. And there's always a concern that threats will become reality. But I think historically there's a lot of communities are very sympathetic towards Tibet, but they're also have economic interests. So for example, Africa was essentially completely colonized. And I know this isn't Asia, but I'm moving towards what I'm familiar with. And so Africa was completely colonized, and there were numerous instances of people fighting for their self-determination against colonization, and very intelligent, eloquent people speaking for the requirement of self-determination of all peoples, so everyone, including Tibetans. But they also have economic interests, and balancing the two is something that's difficult to do. And it could be that, I think right now, 34 African states have acceded to the Rome Statute. And Kenya, their parliament at least, is talking about pulling out of the Rome Statute because they're unhappy with the prosecution. And Kenya is trying to get other states to join them. So on October 18th, the members of the African Union, including 34 signatories to the Rome Statute, will be talking about international justice and international criminal justice. And by most accounts, it's very unlikely that even Kenya will leave the International Criminal Court, let alone the other 33 states. But that'll revitalize the discussion of justice and ideals. And it could be coming out of that they're more sympathetic towards the Tibetan situation. But it could also be that balancing their economic interests, they think it's not worth pursuing. And best I can. Any other? Yeah.
John, what I've seen here is that most people around the world, because we get foreigners from everywhere, every day, do not know what is happening in Tibet. It is not in the news. So how can it gain support from anywhere if nobody knows about it?
So the question is, here everyone is surrounded by Tibetan issues, especially when you're in a Tibet museum with a monument outside the window. But elsewhere in the world, be it Taiwan, Japan, Tokyo, I'll be consistent with kind of Taiwan, Japan, United States, Australia, New Zealand, Tanzania, South Africa, if they don't know about it, there's nothing they can do. And that's the role of collective action. That's the role of people, corporations, individuals saying, we're not going to do this, or we're not going to support China, or we're going to make sure people know. We're going to call senators, we're going to call congressmen. We're going to talk about it in a way that gets people's attention. And that's really the best you can do. And so, for example, if Google had Google.cn, which was the search engine for China, and they were censoring results according to Chinese law. And they said, enough, we can't do it, you're still trying to hack into our servers, and we're gone, we're not going to have Google.cn anymore. And that got international attention very quickly. And today people still talk about the Great Firewall and censorship in China. And big dramatic events like that, from something people can relate to, gets people's attention. Yeah.
Another thing is because China doesn't have freedom, and it's not, people in China are also being detained and tortured, and all of the human rights violations of its own people. It doesn't necessarily equate that it's going to respect the freedom of Tibetans. So it's part of the quest for like freeing Tibet, also part of like freeing, China as well.
So for people who couldn't hear it, I'll try to cut the question down, and if I miss something, throw something at me. And so the question was essentially, there are human rights abuses in China as well. And there are human rights abuses and crimes against humanity in Tibet. And they're not separate. They're being done by the same government, and often it's the same tactics. And so, focusing on, shouldn't we be focusing on both, essentially, right?
That if they don't respect their own the freedom of their own people, how are they going to respect the freedom of another people that they're governing?
So, if the Chinese aren't going to respect Tibetan, if they're not going to respect the rights of their own people, they're not going to respect the rights of anyone else. And yeah, absolutely. I think, especially lately, you've seen human rights abuses, including, specifically torture is one of the ones that's been most documented. They don't stay in one place. So they begin, for example, during a war. You commit torture to save lives. And during the Korean War, the Chinese took tactics that the North Koreans were using against what were ostensibly the United Nations troops, but really the Americans, and said, we're going to modify them, but then they came back. And people who research torture say torture during a war casts a 20-year shadow over police detention and everything else. And so there's not a difference between separating Tibetan human rights and Chinese human rights, because they are all human rights. But what's happening is that the abuses you see in Tibet are spreading into China. And so advocating for Chinese human rights, which is something there are many organizations that do, also has an impact on human rights in Tibet, and vice versa. Is that good? Or I can keep going. I can always keep going.
I wonder if the approach to the different approaches that you talked about for what can people do to help Tibet, if those change at all when your focus is on not just Tibet but also Tibet and China.
It affects kind of how you talk about it, because so I only half answered the question. And It was, how does advocating for human rights in the People's Republic of China, including Tibet, change from just talking about human rights in Tibet? And it affects the language you use and who you focus on. Because in China, there's a little bit more freedom regarding the use of Twitter and things like that. And after abuses, it's not completely shut down, and the censors aren't as dictatorial, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. And they can't, and for example, there was an article recently about how there are environmental activists in China now. And the environment in Tibet's being destroyed in China, it's not very good either. They have 7 of the 10 most polluted cities. And so they said, everyone take a photo of your river. And people took photos of their rivers, and they were all horribly polluted. And it got some action going because the Chinese government realized people care about this and it's something we need to do. And in that case, in advocating for environmental policy doesn't just affect Shanghai, Beijing, and the Chinese areas, it also affects Tibet. But you just frame it slightly differently depending on what you're talking about and who you're talking to.
Thank you.
Just coming back to Adele's question about the Asian cities, that was a brilliant thought because when you actually, if you like, sorry. Just coming back to the Asian question, when you actually look at a lot of the Asian countries and their relationship with Tibet and what's going on in those countries, obviously you've had a free election yet, and that most Burmese people still haven't got basic education or any sort of health care other than what's provided by donor countries. If you have a look at, say, Japan hasn't apologised to the South Korean women for World War II, even though they've apologised to Australia and the UK, etc. If you look at some of these internal issues, Singapore being the Swiss bankers for the...
No, we're done.
Oh, go on, let me.
And as Kerry just said, now we should support these countries. In some ways it's setting up a dualism which actually isn't that helpful. And and actually the question was, why aren't, forget the internal politics, forget their human rights records, why aren't Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, very rich countries in Asia, just openly and publicly declaring more support for Tibet?
Good question.
I don't know.
Countries that they're dependent on rivers that originate in Tibet, which are now controlled by China, so they have to think, I think, 3 times more than Western countries or European countries. But I do agree with you that we haven't, enough advocacy or enough lobbying hasn't been done towards these other countries, but why they haven't said anything is, I feel, essentially the same reason